every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The lane was known to the locals as the Black Pad. It was more of a footpath than a road, a narrow ribbon of asphalt cutting a shortcut through the grounds of the Carlton Hayes Psychiatric Hospital in Narborough, Leicestershire. In the autumn of 1983, it was a place of quiet, bucolic utility. By day, dog walkers and children on bicycles would use it to shave a few minutes off their journey. But as the early winter nights of November drew in, the Black Pad transformed. The overarching trees blotted out the sparse streetlights from the village, creating a tunnel of profound darkness. It was a place where the familiar sounds of village life, a distant television, a barking dog, gave way to the whisper of the wind through skeletal branches, and the rustle of unseen things in the overgrown hedgerows. It was a place that functioned on an unspoken social contract, a trust inherent to small-town English life, that the shadows held no genuine menace. It was a trust that was about to be irrevocably, violently obliterated. On the evening of Monday, November 21st, 15-year-old Linda Mann was walking home. It was a journey of no more than 10 minutes, a simple trip from a friend's house back to the warmth and light of her own family. She was a typical teenager of her time, immersed in the pop culture of the early 80s, a girl described by all who knew her as bubbly, kind, and full of life. She was likely thinking about friends, music, the week of school ahead, the small, important details of a teenage world. She could not have been thinking about the man who was waiting in the darkness. She couldn't have known that her final terrifying moments would become the unwilling catalyst for a scientific revolution, that her tragic death would send ripples out from this forgotten English footpath to fundamentally alter the course of justice in courtrooms and crime labs across the entire globe. She was just a girl, walking home. And then she was gone. The silence that fell over the Black Pad that night was not an empty one. It was a silence filled with a terrible secret, a secret that would lie dormant, locked away in the biological essence of her killer, a microscopic signature waiting for a science that for all practical purposes did not yet exist. This is Anatomy of Crime, and today we are not just dissecting a double murder that shocked a nation. We are dissecting the precise moment that crime fighting evolved into a new species. We will trace the path of an investigation that began with footprints in the mud and fibers on a jacket, and ended with the elegant, irrefutable truth of a double helix. This is the story of how the hunt for one brutal predator in the heart of England forced the birth of the most powerful investigative tool in modern history, DNA fingerprinting. It is a story of two murdered children, a falsely accused man, and a scientist's flash of genius that changed everything. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a forensic revolution. The story begins in a place and time that felt, to its residents, deeply safe. The county of Leicestershire in the early 1980s was the epitome of the English heartland, a patchwork of rolling green fields, ancient market towns, and quiet, unassuming villages like Narborough. This was Margaret Thatcher's Britain, a nation in the throes of immense social and economic change. But in rural corners like this, life often felt insulated from the turmoil of the wider world. The local community was tight-knit, a place where families had lived for generations, where gossip traveled fast but serious crime felt like something that happened elsewhere, something you read about in the papers or saw on the television news. The Mann family was part of this fabric. On the evening of November 21, 1983, 15-year-old Linda had spent the evening babysitting before heading to a friend's house on Thistley Lays Road. Around 7:30 p.m., she said her goodbyes for the short walk home, Her expected route, the quickest route, was down the black pad. When she failed to arrive, her parents, Kath and Eddie Mann, began the ritual familiar to any parent whose child is late. First, annoyance, then a nagging worry. They made phone calls to her friends. No one had seen her. The worry quickly curdled into a cold, sharp-edged panic. By 10 p.m., they called the police. A search was organized almost immediately, a frantic scramble into the cold November night. Neighbors, friends, and local police officers fanned out, their flashlight beams cutting cones of white light through the oppressive darkness, their voices calling her name into a silence that offered no reply. The search of the black pad and the surrounding hospital grounds was fruitless. The night yielded nothing but a growing, collective dread that settled over the village like a fog. The next morning, Tuesday, November 22nd, as the gray morning light filtered through the trees, a hospital porter taking a shortcut across the grounds made a discovery that would confirm the community's worst fears. In a secluded copse, just a stone's throw from the footpath, lay the body of Linda Mann. The scene was one of contained, brutal violence. She had been sexually assaulted and then strangled with her own scarf. The idyllic peace of Narborough had been shattered. The monster that every community fears, the one that comes from within, had shown its face. The investigation was launched immediately, a massive undertaking headed by Detective Chief Superintendent David Baker of the Leicestershire Constabulary. Baker was a seasoned, respected old-school detective, methodical, thorough, and reliant on the established techniques of the day. But from the very beginning, the crime scene was a source of immense frustration. It offered precious little to work with. There were no witnesses who had seen or heard the attack. The killer had left behind no obvious, tangible clues, no weapon, no buttons torn from a coat, no identifiable fingerprints on the body or nearby surfaces. The investigation was a product of its time, a forensic snapshot of the early 1980s. The pathologist, Dr. Jeffrey Garrett, conducted a post-mortem examination that confirmed the cause of death as manual strangulation. He also painstakingly collected trace evidence, including semen samples, from Linda's body. In 1983, this biological evidence provided a very limited and ultimately frustrating amount of information. Forensic scientists at the Home Office's laboratory in Huntingdon could determine the killer's blood type through the now outdated ABO system. The samples revealed he was a secretor with type A blood. They could also test for specific protein markers in the fluid, in this case an enzyme called phosphoglucosamidase, or PGM. The killer's profile was PGM1+. This was, at the time, a significant forensic marker. It could, in theory, be used to eliminate suspects who didn't share these biological characteristics. The problem was one of probability. This specific combination of blood type and enzyme profile was shared by approximately 10% of the adult male population in Britain. In a manhunt covering just the local area, this meant that hundreds, if not thousands of men could be a potential match. It was a broadsword, not a scalpel, a tool for exclusion, not for positive identification. The police had a biological shadow of their killer, but no face, no name, no way to distinguish him from a crowd of other men. The investigation became a monumental exercise in painstaking, conventional, and ultimately fruitless police work. Detectives embarked on a massive house-to-house canvass, interviewing anyone and everyone who lived near the black pad. They took over 1,500 detailed statements. They investigated every known sex offender in the wider Leicestershire region. They followed up on every piece of local gossip, every report of a suspicious vehicle, every man who was known to act strangely. Given the proximity to the psychiatric hospital, they meticulously reviewed the records of patients, both current and recently discharged, looking for anyone with a history of sexual violence. The community, gripped by a fear it had never known, tried to help. But every lead, every potential suspect, was eventually cleared or led nowhere. The killer seemed to have emerged from the darkness of the black pad and vanished back into it, leaving behind only a broken family and a community that now knew with sickening certainty that monsters were real. The case file grew thicker and thicker with reports, statements, and forensic dead ends, a paper testament to immense effort and crushing frustration. The murder of Linda Mann became a persistent aching wound in the heart of Leicestershire, and for 3 long years, the case went cold. The killer, whoever he was walking free, perhaps living right there among them, his secret locked safely away. For nearly 3 years, the village of Narborough and the surrounding communities lived with the ghost of Linda Mann's murder. The initial shock and media frenzy had subsided into a low-grade, constant state of anxiety. The social contract had been broken. The unspoken trust was gone. Parents who had once let their children roam freely now kept them close. Children were walked to school and ferried to friends' houses by car. The black pad, once a convenient shortcut, was now a place of grim pilgrimage for some, and an actively avoided landmark for others. A permanent reminder of the predator who had walked among them, and then disappeared as if he were a phantom. Life as it must went on. But it was a life irrevocably changed, shadowed by the chilling knowledge that a killer had gotten away with murder and was still out there, somewhere. The police file remained officially open, but with no new leads, no new evidence, and no new suspects, it gathered dust. The killer's trail was frozen solid. Then, on the last day of July in 1986, the nightmare returned with a terrifying sense of déjà vu. 15-year-old Dawn Ashworth lived in the nearby village of Enderby, just a short distance from Narborough. She was described as a friendly but somewhat shy girl, a diligent student who was well-liked by her friends and adored by her family. On the afternoon of Thursday, July 31st, she left home to visit a friend, telling her parents she'd be back by 6:30 p.m. for dinner. Her intended route took her along a footpath known as 10-Pound Lane. It was a shortcut, much like the black pad, a path that cut through fields and woods, a route she had taken many times before without incident. When she didn't return home at the appointed time, her parents began to worry. As the evening wore on, that worry intensified into the same familiar panic that had gripped the Mann family 3 years earlier. They called the police. The immediate and chilling parallels to the Linda Mann case sent a jolt of ice-cold fear through both the community and the Leicestershire Constabulary. Another 15-year-old girl. Another shortcut through a secluded area. Another disappearance. DCS David Baker, still heading the cold case investigation into Linda's murder, knew instantly that this was no coincidence. A massive search was launched immediately, far larger and more urgent than the one 3 years prior. Hundreds of police officers, supplemented by local volunteers and even military personnel, were mobilized. For 2 agonizing days, they formed long lines and scoured the fields, woodlands, and ditches around Enderby. The search ended on the morning of Saturday, August 2nd, when Dawn's body was found in a thicket of dense scrubland off 10-Pound Lane, a location that became known as the Fox's Covert. The scene was brutally, hauntingly familiar to the seasoned detectives. She, too, had been sexually assaulted and violently strangled. The discovery plunged the entire region back into a state of terror. The post-mortem examination confirmed their worst fears. The method of the killing, the nature of the assault, the victim profile, it all pointed to the terrifying conclusion that the same killer was responsible. The monster who had haunted their community for 3 years had not disappeared. He had merely been dormant. He had resurfaced, and he had killed again. The forensic analysis of the semen samples recovered from Don's body solidified the link beyond any doubt. The killer's biological markers were identical to those found on Lindemann. Blood group A and the PGM1+ enzyme profile. The police now knew they were not just hunting a killer. They were hunting a serial killer, a predator, who was comfortable and confident in his own territory. The pressure on Detective Baker and his team became immense, almost unbearable. The public was terrified and demanding answers. The national media descended on Leicestershire, and the Narborough Strangler, as he was dubbed, became the subject of intense press coverage. Baker relaunched the investigation with renewed vigor and resources. Codenaming it Operation Ivanhoe, they now had 2 murders, separated by 3 years, but linked by an undeniable forensic and behavioral signature. They re-interviewed old suspects, cross-referencing their whereabouts on the dates of both killings. They created a new canvas area, interviewing more than 5,000 men, but they were still fighting the same war with the same limited weapons. They were still looking for a man who was, forensically speaking, one of 10% of the population. They were drowning in a sea of data, interviewing thousands of innocent men, with no reliable way to isolate the one man they were looking for. It was during this frantic period of renewed investigation that the police believed they finally got their break. Their attention fell on a 17-year-old kitchen porter named Richard Buckland. Buckland worked at the Carlton Hayes Psychiatric Hospital, the very place Lindemann's body had been found near 3 years earlier. He was known to police for a history of minor sexual offenses, including flashing. Critically, during the search for Dawn Ashworth, he had approached a police officer and seemed to possess an unusual and detailed knowledge of the area where her body was eventually found. He also made some bizarre and inconsistent statements that immediately raised suspicion. On August 8, 1986, just 6 days after Dawn's body was discovered, Richard Buckland was brought in for questioning. The interrogation was intense. Buckland had recognized learning difficulties and a low IQ. He was psychologically vulnerable, easily led, and likely terrified and overwhelmed by the high-pressure environment of the police station. Over the course of several days of rigorous questioning, he began to break down. He eventually gave his interrogators what they were so desperate to hear: a confession. He provided a detailed, graphic account of stalking, assaulting, and murdering Dawn Ashworth. For the exhausted and pressured police force, who had been working for years without a solid lead, it felt like the case was finally over. They had a confession. They had their man. There were, however, deeply troubling inconsistencies that should have served as bright red flags. While Buckland had confessed in detail to Dawn's murder, he adamantly and consistently denied any involvement in the killing of Lindemann. This was a major problem for the police's central theory that one man had committed both crimes. The forensic evidence from both scenes pointed to a single perpetrator. The detectives, convinced of Buckland's guilt and likely suffering from confirmation bias, continued to press him. Eventually, exhausted, confused, and suggestible, he broke down completely and confessed to Linda's murder as well, though his account of the first crime was vague, inconsistent, and lacked the disturbing detail of his first confession. Despite these glaring weaknesses, the Leicestershire Constabulary felt they had enough. On August 11th, Richard Buckland was formally charged with the murders of both Linda Mann and Don Ashworth. The public announcement was made, and the community breathed a massive collective sigh of relief. The monster had been caught, but that relief was tragically premature. The case was about to collide with a quiet scientific discovery so profound it would not only tear the prosecution's case to shreds, but would change the world forever. While the police were meticulously building their seemingly solid case against Richard Buckland, a quiet and profound revolution was underway in a small, cluttered laboratory at the nearby University of Leicester. The man at its center was Dr. Alec Jeffreys, a 34-year-old geneticist. Jeffreys was not a forensic scientist. He was a pure academic, and his work was focused on medical genetics. He was studying how genes are inherited through families and how they could be used as markers to diagnose and track hereditary diseases. In the course of his research, he became fascinated by what were then called mini-satellites, stretches of DNA that don't code for proteins, but instead feature short sequences of genetic code that repeat themselves over and over again. Jeffreys had observed that the number of these repeats varied dramatically from one person to the next. He hypothesized that these highly variable regions could act as unique markers of identity. On the morning of Monday, September 10, 1984, at precisely 9:05 a.m., a moment Jeffreys would later call his eureka moment, he was in his lab's darkroom. He was examining a piece of X-ray film, the result of a DNA experiment he had run on his lab technician, Vicki Wilson, and her parents. The goal was to see how these mini-satellites were inherited. When he held the film up to the light, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. The film showed a series of dark bands, arranged in vertical lanes, looking for all the world like a supermarket barcode. Vicki's pattern contained a mixture of bands clearly inherited from her mother and father. But her own pattern, and theirs, was completely, dazzlingly unique. Jeffreys realized in a flash of insight that the implications of what he was seeing went far, far beyond his own niche research. He was looking at a method to identify individuals with a degree of accuracy that was previously the stuff of science fiction. Every single person's DNA, with the sole exception of identical twins, produced a one-of-a-kind pattern. He had stumbled upon what he would immediately dub DNA fingerprinting. The first practical application of his groundbreaking discovery was not in criminal law, but in a contentious civil immigration case in 1985. The technique was used to resolve a dispute where a Ghanaian boy was being denied entry to the UK because immigration officials did not believe he was the son of a British citizen. Jeffreys' test proved with absolute certainty that the boy was indeed her son, reuniting the family and preventing his deportation. The case made national headlines and established the incredible power and credibility of Jeffreys' technique. It was this publicity that brought his work to the attention of the police in the Ashworth and Mann investigation. The officers, despite having a detailed confession from Richard Buckland, were still privately troubled by his initial strenuous denial of the first murder. They wanted to definitively and scientifically link him to at least one of the crimes. They had the semen samples from Don Ashworth's body. They had a fresh blood sample from Richard Buckland. In late 1986, they approached Alec Jeffreys with a historic request. Could he use his new science to prove that the semen found on Don Ashworth belonged to their suspect, Richard Buckland, and thus cement their case against him? Jeffreys, intrigued by the challenge and aware of the stakes, agreed. This would be the first time his technique was ever used in a criminal investigation. He received the precious samples from the Home Office, a blood sample from Richard Buckland, the preserved semen sample recovered from the body of Dawn Ashworth, and, crucially, the preserved 3-year-old sample from the body of Linda Mann. The police confidently expected a simple confirmation of guilt. What they got instead was a scientific bombshell that blew their entire case to pieces. The process in Jeffrey's university lab was painstaking and methodical. This was not the rapid, automated process we see today. It was a manually intensive procedure known as restriction fragment length polymorphism, or RFLP analysis. His team, including his trusted technician Peter Gill, extracted the long strands of DNA from each of the 3 samples. They then used special enzymes to act like molecular scissors, chopping the DNA into fragments at specific points. Because the length of these fragments is determined by the repeating mini-satellite sequences, each person's DNA produces a unique collection of different-sized fragments. These fragments were then placed in a gel and separated by size using an electric current, a process called electrophoresis. Finally, the separated fragments were transferred to a nylon membrane and exposed to radioactive probes that would latch onto the mini-satellite sequences, creating the dark bands on the X-ray film. The entire process took several weeks. When the final films were developed, the results were stunningly clear and completely devastating to the police case. The first result was a powerful confirmation of the police's long-held theory. The DNA profile generated from the semen sample found on Linda Mann was a perfect band-for-band match to the DNA profile from the sample found on Dawn Ashworth. The science proved with a certainty approaching 100% that the same man had murdered both girls. This was a crucial finding, validating the entire premise of their investigation. But it was the next result that changed everything. The DNA profile of the killer, this unified profile from both crime scenes, did not match the DNA profile of Richard Buckland. It wasn't close. It wasn't ambiguous. It was a clear, undeniable, and total exclusion. The man who had confessed in detail to the murders, the man the police were about to send to trial, was innocent. The news hit the Leicestershire Constabulary like a physical blow. They were faced with an undeniable, objective scientific fact that completely contradicted their prime suspect's own confession. Detective Baker and his team were forced to confront a terrible reality. They had likely coerced a confession from a vulnerable, innocent young man. Alec Jeffreys had not only proven Buckland's innocence in the murder of Dawn Ashworth, but by scientifically linking the 2 crimes, he had also, in the same breath, exonerated him for the murder of Linda Mann. On November 21, 1986, the charges against Richard Buckland were formally dropped. In a brief court hearing, he was set free, becoming the first person in legal history to be cleared of a crime as a result of DNA evidence. The police were in an unprecedented and deeply embarrassing position. Their suspect was gone. The public's brief relief turned back into widespread fear, but amidst the wreckage of their case, they possessed something no police force in history had ever had before: the killer's unique, unchangeable biological identifier. They didn't know his name, his face, or where he lived, but they had his DNA fingerprint. The manhunt was on again, but the rules of the game had been completely and irrevocably rewritten. The exoneration of Richard Buckland left DCS David Baker and the Leicestershire Police with a monumental problem and a revolutionary opportunity. The problem was that their chief suspect was innocent, the real killer was still at large, and the entire investigation was essentially back at square one, but now under a brighter, more critical media spotlight. The community was once again gripped by terror, knowing the predator was still living in their midst. But the opportunity was tantalizing. For the first time in history, law enforcement possessed a definitive way to identify the culprit. They had a genetic photograph of their suspect. All they needed to do was find the man who matched it. This led Detective Baker, in consultation with his team and Alec Jeffries, to devise a radical, audacious, and unprecedented plan. Something that sounded like it was straight out of science fiction. They decided to launch the world's first mass DNA screening. The idea was simple in concept, but absolutely staggering in its logistical complexity and its ethical implications. They would ask every single man between the ages of 17 and 34 who either lived or worked in the three villages at the heart of the investigation, Narborough, Enderby, and Littlethorpe, to voluntarily provide a blood or saliva sample for DNA testing. The police reasoned that the killer was almost certainly a local, someone who knew the area's footpaths and shortcuts intimately, someone who had been living undetected among his neighbors for years. If he was in that age bracket, and if he voluntarily gave a sample, they would have him. In January of 1987, the bloodings, as the press and public came to call them, began. The police embarked on a massive public relations campaign to explain the process and secure the cooperation of the community. They held town hall meetings, assuring residents of the confidentiality of the process. They set up temporary clinics in village halls, schools, and community centers. They went door to door with letters of appeal. The response from the local male population was nothing short of overwhelming. A combination of profound fear and a powerful sense of civic duty drove thousands of men to participate. They lined up in village halls, had their fingers pricked for a blood sample, or their mouths swabbed for saliva, and filled out the necessary paperwork, each man hoping his individual cooperation would contribute to catching the monster who had terrorized their home. It was a massive, expensive, and time-consuming undertaking. Over the course of the next 9 months, more than 5,500 men provided samples. Each sample, meticulously labeled and documented, was then sent for analysis. Initially, the work was done at Alec Jeffries' University lab, but the sheer volume soon became unmanageable. The Home Office contracted with a commercial entity, ICI Cellmark Diagnostics, to handle the bulk of the screening. The process was slow and methodical. Each new sample was converted into a DNA fingerprint and compared against the definitive profile of the killer, which was derived from the crime scene evidence. A sense of anticipation and hope filled the investigation. Surely, one of these samples would be the one. Weeks turned into months. Hundreds, then thousands of samples were processed and analyzed, and each one came back negative. No match. The police and the scientists running the tests grew increasingly frustrated and disheartened. They had screened nearly every single eligible man in the area, yet the killer's DNA profile remained stubbornly unique. It seemed impossible. Had the killer moved away in the intervening years? Had he died? Or, most disturbingly, had he somehow managed to avoid the screening? The police had tried to account for every possibility. They cross-referenced their list of volunteers against electoral rolls and employer records to find those who hadn't participated. They tracked down men who were away in the military, those serving time in prison for other offenses, or those who had moved away from the area since the murders. They followed up, got their samples, and tested them. Still, nothing. By the summer of 1987, the DNA dragnet, this revolutionary and hugely expensive approach to crime fighting appeared to have been a colossal failure. The investigation had once again hit a solid brick wall, and morale, both within the police force and the community, was at an all-time low. The killer, it seemed, had slipped through the most advanced forensic net ever devised. The police were left to wonder if he was simply too clever, or too lucky to be caught. The truth was, he was both, and the clue that would finally undo him would come not from a sophisticated laboratory, but from a piece of careless, boastful chatter in a local pub. The breakthrough, when it finally came in the late summer of 1987, had nothing to do with molecular biology or high-tech science. It came from two of the most ancient and reliable human fallibilities, gossip and guilt. In August, a group of bakers were having after-work drinks at the Clarendon pub in Leicester. One of them, a man named Ian Kelly, found himself the subject of some loud teasing from his colleagues. The source of the ribbing was the ongoing DNA dragnet. A woman sitting at a nearby table couldn't help but overhear one of the men joking about how Kelly had been brave enough to take the blood test on behalf of his friend and co-worker, Colin Pitchfork. Most people might have dismissed it as idle pub chatter, but the woman, disturbed by the implications of what she had heard, felt a civic duty to report it. She contacted the police. Initially, the tip may have seemed like just another of the thousands the police had to investigate. But in an investigation that had been stalled for months, every lead, no matter how tenuous, was precious. Detectives were dispatched to find and interview Ian Kelly. At first, he was evasive and denied everything. But under persistent questioning, the whole story came tumbling out. Kelly admitted that his friend and colleague, Colin Pitchfork, had approached him with an unusual request. Pitchfork had spun Kelly a carefully crafted, plausible-sounding lie. He claimed that years earlier he had a conviction for flashing as a teenager. He told Kelly he was worried that if he gave a DNA sample, his prior offense would come to light, and the police, in their desperation, might try to mistakenly frame him for the murders. He pleaded with Kelly to take the test for him, to pretend to be him, just this once. To make the deception convincing, Pitchfork had given Kelly his passport, which he had cleverly doctored with Kelly's photograph. He even coached him on how to answer personal questions that might be asked at the clinic. Feeling pressured by his friend, and naively believing the story about the minor criminal record, Kelly had agreed. He went to the testing clinic, presented himself as Colin Pitchfork, showed the doctored passport, and gave a blood sample in his friend's name. For the investigators listening to this story, it was the lightning bolt they had been waiting nearly a year for. This was it. This was how the killer had slipped through their multi-million-pound net. He hadn't refused the test, an act that would have drawn immediate and intense suspicion. He had been far more cunning. He had found a proxy. He had subverted the entire system. Suddenly, the police had a new and very compelling prime suspect, a man who had gone to extraordinary lengths to avoid providing his own DNA. His name was Colin Pitchfork. The police immediately launched a covert and intensive investigation into his background. Pitchfork was 27 years old, a skilled baker at a local firm called Hampshire's Bakery, the same place Ian Kelly worked. He was married to a woman named Carol and was the father of 2 young sons. He lived in a council house in the nearby village of Littlethorpe, placing him right in the geographical heart of the search area. On the surface, he was completely, almost aggressively, unremarkable. He was a family man, a quiet neighbor, someone who would never have stood out in a crowd. But digging deeper, police discovered a darker, hidden side. Pitchfork had a history of indecent exposure. He was a serial flasher who for years had terrorized women on lonely roads, deriving a thrill from their fear. It was a pattern of escalating sexual deviancy, a secret life hidden behind a carefully maintained facade of normality. This disturbing history, combined with his desperate and calculated deception to avoid the DNA test, made him their number one target. On the morning of September 19, 1987, police officers arrived at Colin Pitchfork's home and arrested him on suspicion of the murders of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth. During his initial interrogation, he was cool, calm, and collected. He denied everything. He stuck to the same story he had told Ian Kelly, insisting he was only trying to hide a youthful indiscretion. But the police were no longer relying on confessions or denials. They had the objective, irrefutable power of Alec Jeffries' science. They took a buccal swab from Pitchfork's mouth and rushed the sample to the laboratory. The wait was agonizingly short. Alec Jeffries and his team processed the sample and compared its profile to the one derived from the crime scenes 4 years and 1 year prior. The result was unequivocal. The banding pattern, the genetic barcode, was a perfect match. The DNA from Colin Pitchfork was the same as the DNA found on the bodies of both Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth. They had him. When he was confronted with the undeniable scientific evidence, Colin Pitchfork's calm demeanor finally shattered. He slumped in his chair, began to cry, and then he confessed everything. Over the next few days, he gave a detailed and chillingly dispassionate account of both murders. He described how he had stalked Linda Mann on the black pad in 1983, how he had grabbed her from behind, dragged her into the trees, raped her, and then strangled her with her own scarf, all while his infant son slept in his car nearby. He spoke of it not with remorse, but with a disturbing matter-of-factness. Then he described the murder of Dawn Ashworth 3 years later. He had been driving his car when he saw her walking alone. On impulse, he followed her, attacked her in the same brutal manner, and left her body in the woods. His confession filled in the final, horrific details of a case that had haunted a region for 4 years. The double life of Colin Pitchfork was over. The unremarkable local baker was exposed as a brutal, predatory serial killer who had hidden in plain sight. The legal proceedings that followed were, in themselves, historic. In January of 1988, Colin Pitchfork appeared at the Leicester Crown Court. Facing the overwhelming and utterly damning DNA evidence against him, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of rape, and 1 count of conspiracy to pervert the course of justice for his deception involving Ian Kelly. Because of the guilty plea, the DNA evidence was never challenged in a contested trial, but it was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, outlined in detail for the court. The trial was less about determining guilt or innocence and more about the formal presentation of a new era of justice. During sentencing, the judge, Mr. Justice Otten, did not mince words. He described Pitchfork's crimes as being marked by calculation, callousness, and extreme cruelty, calling him a cunning, cruel, and dangerous man who possessed a capacity for evil. He acknowledged the immense and prolonged suffering of the victims' families, who had endured years of uncertainty and grief, first with no suspect, and then with the false arrest of an innocent man. The judge also paid tribute to the revolutionary scientific work of Sir Alec Jeffries, who was knighted for his discovery, and the monumental, persevering efforts of the Leicestershire Constabulary. On January 22, 1988, Colin Pitchfork was sentenced to life in prison, with a recommended minimum term of 30 years. For the families of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, and for the entire community of Leicestershire, it was the end of a long and terrifying ordeal. The case was officially closed, but its legacy, its impact on the world, was just beginning. The conviction of Colin Pitchfork was more than just the resolution of a tragic double murder. It was a watershed moment, a bright line drawn in the history of criminal investigation. The anatomy of this case is therefore unique. It isn't found in the complex psychology of a seemingly ordinary man who was secretly a predator, though that is a chilling component. It isn't found in a critique of investigative methods, though the false confession of Richard Buckland stands as a stark and permanent warning against coercive interrogation. The true, unique anatomy of the Pitchfork case is the anatomy of a paradigm shift. It is the story of how abstract academic research, born of pure curiosity in a university laboratory, became the most concrete and powerful tool for establishing truth that the legal system had ever seen. The case provided two monumental firsts, a perfectly balanced set of justice. It was the first time DNA evidence was used to exonerate a person accused of murder, saving Richard Buckland from a potential lifetime in prison for a crime he did not commit. This demonstrated the science's profound power not just to convict the guilty, but to protect the innocent from the inherent fallibility of other forms of evidence, like eyewitness testimony or coerced confessions. And it was the first time a murderer was caught and convicted as a direct result of mass DNA screening. The dragnet, which had initially seemed like a costly failure, ultimately worked exactly as intended. It didn't find the killer directly in its mesh, but it created a pressure that flushed him out, forcing him to take a risky step that led the police right to his door. From this single, provincial English case, a global revolution in forensics was launched. Police forces and governments around the world rushed to adopt and fund DNA technology. National DNA databases were established, like the UK National DNA Database and CODIS in the United States, holding the genetic profiles of convicted offenders. This allowed police to match crime scene evidence not just to current suspects, but to a vast library of past criminals, solving cold cases that were decades old. The silent witness, that tiny speck of biological material left at a crime scene, a drop of blood, a single hair, a few skin cells under a victim's fingernails, could now speak with a clear, almost infallible voice. The legacy of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth is therefore a deeply complicated one. Their brutal and senseless murders were an unimaginable tragedy, a profound loss that their families have had to carry for decades. But from that local tragedy, a new, more certain kind of justice was born, a gift to the entire world. The chain of events remains remarkable, a geneticist's serendipitous eureka moment, a police force's desperation and eventual willingness to embrace the unknown, the courage of two grieving families who never gave up hope, and the collective cooperation of an entire community all converged to forge this new weapon for truth. The case serves as a permanent reminder that the answers to our most violent and perplexing questions can sometimes be found in the most microscopic of places. Colin Pitchfork's story did not end with his imprisonment. He became eligible for parole, and in June of 2021, the Parole Board of England and Wales deemed him fit for release. Despite public outcry and the passionate protests of the victims' families and local politicians, he was released from prison in September 2021 after serving 33 years. His freedom was short-lived. Within just 2 months, he was recalled to prison for breaching his strict license conditions, after, he was observed approaching young women in a way that caused serious concern for his probation officers. The cycle of his predatory nature, it seemed, was not so easily broken by time or incarceration. But the forensic science he inadvertently helped to pioneer continues its relentless evolution, growing more sensitive, faster, and more powerful with each passing year, a permanent and enduring barrier against the kind of darkness he represents. The revolution that began in a small Leicestershire laboratory now operates on a global scale, an invisible shield forged in the crucible of an unforgettable tragedy. It ensures that while monsters may still walk among us, they no longer have the luxury of leaving no trace. They are now forced to leave behind the one thing they can never change: themselves. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.